Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our very first Antarctica Insight Live. We have a series of webinars like this one coming up throughout the winter, so that if you can't be in Antarctica, we will bring Antarctica to you. Our intention is to explore Antarctica in a bit more detail, aspects both familiar and perhaps less well known, and bring experts to you to share their insights into this endlessly fascinating place. We are hugely grateful to our season partner, Viking, who are generously supporting Antarctica in Live. My name's Camilla Nichol, and I'm the Chief Executive of the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust. And it is my huge pleasure to welcome you all tonight to spend the evening with us, to spend our evening with all of our favourite animal, the penguin. So what we have for you tonight are two penguin experts who are going to discuss all things penguin and are happy to take your questions. So this is your chance to ask everything you ever wanted to know about penguins but never dared ask. So get those questions ready. Please post your questions in the comments and I will put them to the experts throughout the evening tonight. So without further ado, it is my huge pleasure to introduce you to Michael Dunn and Ruth PC.
Hello there, Camilla. Thanks very much for inviting us along today.
Not at all. It's great to see you. Mike, could you tell us who you are, what you do, and how you became involved in penguins?
I certainly can, yes. I'm a penguin ecologist at the British Antarctic Survey, where I've worked for the last 20 years. And during that time, I've been lucky enough to split my life between living with a whole bunch of penguins on an island in the Antarctic and working back at the British Antarctic Survey headquarters in Cambridge. And it's been a real privilege. It's been a remarkable life being able to do this. And I look forward to sharing some of the insights I've gleaned over those years with you and our audience tonight.
Oh, wonderful. Mike, it's great to have you with us. And Ruth, hey, how are you? It's great to see you. Tell us what you do and how penguins have become part of your life.
Oh, great to see you too, Camilla and Mike. Thank you so much for having me along this evening. I'm a wildlife filmmaker and my specialism has become penguins, and that is largely thanks to Port Lockroy, where I spent 5 months filming the breeding cycle of Gen 2 penguins, and subsequently I've gone on to do multiple expeditions in various forms down to Antarctica. I've spent more than 3 years of my life down in the southern region with penguins, so I look forward to sharing those experiences tonight.
Oh, wonderful. I have to say, you probably have the two most enviable jobs in the world. I have to say, all our audience, we sit there, God, how do you get to become a penguin wildlife photographer and a researcher? But I thought what we could do tonight is just let's talk about penguins. Let's find out a bit more about them. Any surprising things? We're interested in your insights. So let's maybe start with something simple. So how many species are there of penguin and where are they found in the world? So Mike, do you want to kick off?
Sure, yes, there are 18 species of penguin in the world currently. Penguins belong to a family known as the Sphenicidae, which is spread across six genera. And the 18 species are all in the southern hemisphere. Now, I say 18, but actually there may be more coming because even just a few years ago, there were actually 17. And scientific research, looking particularly at the genetics of the species we have, is beginning to show that actually some species are several more species. So watch this space, and if we're having this conversation in a few years' time, there might be as many as perhaps 20 or even 21 species out there. But Ruth, do you want to jump in and say a little more?
Yeah, I mean, it's very exciting to think that there are different species that are being found even now when we feel that this is an animal we're so familiar with. As you say, they are animals that we've seen and people are aware of, but the furthering of research has enabled us to discover that they are distinct species, and some of the species that perhaps we thought were distinct may be actually one species. But all of that research is still ongoing at the moment, and I can't wait to be able to find out more about it in the coming years.
Sure. I mean, you say the southern hemisphere, so let's clear something up here. Penguins in the south, polar bears in the north. Does ever the twain meet?
Only on Christmas cards, and they're not biologically correct Christmas cards. Gonna get on my high horse now. They're not biologically correct.
So this is the takeaway for the evening: is penguins in the south, polar bears in the north. Never the twain shall meet. Are they all cold climate specialists? Do they all live in cold climates, all live in Antarctica, or do you find them in other places in the southern hemisphere?
No, so it is actually a bit of a misnomer when we say that they are all entirely in the southern hemisphere, because there is one species, the Galapagos penguin, which is actually found around the equator in the Galapagos, as its name might suggest. And because of their habitat and the fact that the Galapagos Islands are found exactly on the equator, they sometimes find themselves north of the equator and actually in the northern hemisphere technically. However, they are only able to live in a tropical region because of the cold water and the way the currents work that push their food source into that area. So all of the penguins do favour cold areas, or at least areas with cold water, because that's where their food source comes. And I'm sure Mike's done quite a lot of research into that area, haven't you, Mike?
So, Mike.
Yeah,
Mike,
that's right, Camilla. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry.
tell us a bit more about how they're specialised, how they're adapted to work in cold water. What do they eat? What's their, have they got any adaptations physically that makes them better at living in cold climates?
Loads of adaptations to that. Yes. Well, first of all, the body shape. They look like a rugby ball. That gives them excellent streamlined properties when they move through the water column. They've not got any sticky out bits. The wings have evolved to become flippers, which gives them superb propulsion. They can really shift through the water. The feet, they're located really far back on their bodies, which gives the comical waddling gait we all see on the land, which actually works quite efficiently, believe it or not, when they walk. But it really comes into its own in the water because, as I mentioned just now, there's no sticky out bits. They're well back. So again, they don't interfere with that streamlined shape. And in fact, instead, work very well as rudders. So that adds to the maneuverability of the birds in the water. So it's all, you can see straight away, I'm coming round to highly evolved for a life aquatic. Less so on the land, but they've still got some pretty neat tricks there as well. They've got excellent layer of fatty tissue on their body, which gives them a certain degree of insulation both in the water and on land. But it works really well coupled with their feathers as well. And they've got several kinds of feathers, but they all work together to give them a really good level of insulation. And they also trap a layer of water between the body and the feathers. Sorry, a layer of water, a layer of air even, between the body and the outside air, which again keeps them nice and warm, both in the water and in the air when they're on the land as well.
So a bit like a wetsuit.
Very much, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. And what do they eat? What do penguins eat?
Well, they eat mostly. They have a mostly fish-based diet, but it depends on the species of penguin. So a lot of the penguins that we're probably most familiar with are Antarctic species of penguins, and those feed primarily on a little crustacean called krill, which looks a little bit like a prawn. It's about that big, and they're quite pink in colour if you find them washed up on the shore, which you do sometimes. And that's, of course, what also gives the penguins feces or guano, their pinkish red colour as well, which I absolutely love, because they just eat so many of them. But they're quite, many of the species are quite adaptable, so they'll eat things like small fish as well, and even some of the species will eat squid as well. So yeah.
And then turn it around. I mean, Mike, what eats penguins? So you got penguins eating krill, which is the bottom of the food chain. What's above? What's who's snapping their jaws at a penguin?
Well, in the water, you've got some pretty serious predators. There are a number of seal species and sea lion species, depending on where you are in the world and which penguin species we're talking about. But if we say put it into the Antarctic context, put Lockroy, then the leopard seal's really the big predator the penguins are watching out for there. Fur seals, Antarctic fur seals will take them as well. In other places, you'll get killer whales doing it. They're not a big meal for a killer whale, but they will take them if they get the opportunity. Other areas, such as, for example, around South Africa, we've got South African penguin. You'll get great white sharks will feed on them. So, they have a lot of things to watch out for in the water, penguins. But on the land too, they have to run the risk of predation. Not so much on the adults, but for the chicks and the eggs, then there are a number of bird predators that they have to be careful of as well. Something called a sheathbill, which is a pigeon-sized bird, all white, has no feathers on its face, so it's quite an unusual looking bird, but it runs around the penguin colonies, and when it gets the opportunity, it dives in amongst them and tries to attack the eggs. And if it can do that, it's got quite a stout beak, and it'll break open an egg, and that'll be an important meal for the sheathbill. But of course, it's bad news for the penguin parents. Something called skuas, which are, again, this is a really important bird predator for Antarctic, in particular, Antarctic penguins. There's several species of skua, but they're about the size of a gull, brown in colour though, so quite different appearance. And they're highly manoeuvrable. They'll swoop down, take young chicks, take eggs. And then you've got something called the giant petrel. There's 2 species of those in the Antarctic. And they're big, much bigger birds with a 6-foot wingspan. And they lumber around. They don't really take the eggs or the chicks, but they'll move in on juvenile penguins, so fledglings, when they're first going into the water, and they'll attack them there. It's pretty dangerous out there being a penguin. What do you say, Ruth?
Yeah, so having spent quite a lot of time sitting amongst them as you have, I have to say, so the best way to sort of describe a skua is kind of like a buzzard of the sky. When I look up, I'm reminded of the buzzards here in the UK. They look very similar in the way that they soar over, and they quite often work in pairs when they're taking young chicks. So one will come in and distract the adult, and then the other one will come in and swoop in and take either the egg or the chick whilst the adult's off being distracted by the first bird. And then you've got the giant petrels, the northern and southern giant petrel, and they're very difficult to tell apart. It's a difference in the beak colour, which we won't go into here, but basically they look like pterodactyls. As Mike said, they've got this huge wingspan, and they just cast this massive shadow over the colony as they pass over. And they're terrifying. They're absolutely terrifying. And the hardest thing, so the worst thing that I've ever seen actually, was a giant petrel drown a very old chick. So this chick was very large, almost at fledgling size. It was well in a crash by itself. It was, starting to get the adult feathers coming through. And the giant petrel actually grabbed it by the neck, it's very graphic, and drowned it in a large puddle before eating it. So they are very, very, very brutal. Sorry for being a bit graphic there, but it's a tough world being a penguin, I have to say, a tough world.
Yeah, I mean, it's highly organised predators, aren't they? I mean, it's really, there's a lot of planning goes into this, isn't it? I mean, but that's, I suppose, this is the food web, isn't it? I guess. I mean, just putting it into kind of the context. I mean, I'm a geologist, so I'm always interested in things long past. I mean, have there always been penguins on Earth, or are they a much more recent species? A group of animals to appear on life on Earth, or have they been? Do you find them in the fossil record?
They're definitely in the fossil record. They've been found in the fossil record going back to 66 million years ago. So back in 2019, the largest penguin fossil was found. It's basically exactly the same height as me, which I'm very proud to say. 1.6 m. I'm slightly taller, but I'd take a shortened height to be the size of a penguin. Weighed a lot more than me though. Well, not a lot more, but quite a bit more. 80 kilograms, which is about 12 stone, and they're 40 centimeters taller than the current largest living penguin, which is of course the emperor penguin. And they were found around 66 to 56 million years ago. They're long extinct now, and that was found, in New Zealand, in a place that I'm probably going to destroy the pronunciation of when I say Waipara. Any advances on that? Sorry. No?
Sounds good to me. We may get letters. Sounds good. But let's hone down a little bit. I mean, at the Antarctic Heritage Trust, we look after Port Lockroy, which is famously, a penguin colony, a heritage site and museum, and post office, of course, in the middle of a penguin colony. So the Antarctic Peninsula is a great place for penguins to live and survive and breed and what have you. Ruth, you spent, as you mentioned, a whole breeding season, didn't you, with the colony at Port Lockroy? Tell us a little bit about that. What was that like? What struck you? What are the experiences you had? Share a little bit of that with us. Take us there.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so Port Lockroy, it was 2013. We arrived, first boat down in the season, and the whole of the bay, that this little island, Goudier Island, which is the home of Port Lockroy, and a colony of 3,000 Gentoo penguin pairs, was there, and it was full of ice. So we had to kind of anchor our little yacht into the sea ice, climb over the front, and hike with a lot of filming gear across sea ice, following the path of the penguins. And we arrived just at the time when all of these penguins were coming back to breed. So we were literally surrounded by penguins for about 1.5 miles, trekking across the snow and ice. And I have to say, now, we found it quite tough. We'd been at sea for a week by this point and got heavy bags and what have you. And we're talking about the penguins' adaptations. They are good walkers when it comes to walking on snow. They might look like they're better adapted for water, but they sure know how to make their way across that ice and that snow. And they were just absolutely amazing. And you can see some pictures of these. These are Gentoo here, the third largest species of penguin, and the penguin that's found at Port Lockwood, as we just mentioned. These guys, when we first arrived, they just started to find their breeding sites. They just started, so it looked very much like this picture here. You can see it was very clean ice and snow with just a few penguins around the base there. And the penguins would come together and they started to form their breeding pairs. So they would reunite. They'd do an ecstatic call where they kind of go like this, and then they bow forward and kind of like that, and they bow to each other and they present. I'm so pleased that the camera wasn't on me for that. And then they start to find their little nests, and quite often they'll find the nests where they were previously, and there might be some stones that have been left over. As the snow starts to melt, it reveals these stones. The penguins are really waiting for the snow to melt, and we were waiting for the snow to melt because we were very, very anxious to make sure that we didn't miss any stages of the breeding cycle. And then, of course, the penguins started to build those nests more and more. We saw the mating, and then we had the rest of the post office workers came to join us. So I was one of a team of 5 people kind of working in the post office, although my job was primarily filmmaking. I was very much welcomed as part of the team and did a few shifts in the post office and helped clean penguin guano off of the walkways and created pathways for people to walk through. And one of the things that I have to say is, being there, I was very keen to make sure that, because you've got penguin highways that run across the island, and these are the routes that the penguins use to get between their nests and back to sea regularly. And I didn't want to get in the way of those highways at all. So I would take great care to make sure that I stood away from them. And I made my own paths. I spent one day entirely digging my own paths. And the next morning I got up ready to go to work with my camera, and all the penguins were using my highways. So in conclusion, I think I'm a better builder of penguin highways than penguins are. but it was,
that's evolution.
Do you know what, exactly, do you know what though, I had a spade, and it was just a magical experience. It really was. You can't the sense of peace and the sense of calm that surrounds you once you're in that environment is just phenomenal. And you've got the noise, and it really is a true cacophony of sounds that come from these penguin colonies. You've got the penguins calling. Once you have chicks, you've got them peeping and then calling very loudly. You've got the calls from skuas passing overhead. You've got calls from the sheathbills, which, yes, are very entertaining, as Mike said, and are everywhere. But beyond that, you've got this backdrop of snow and ice and mountains. And even with all the hustle and bustle that's going on in a penguin colony, you just feel completely at peace. And you can't look at a penguin and not be happy. You just can't. You just can't. It was the best 5 months of my life, just sitting there watching these penguins and watching all the dramas of their lives unfold. You know, it was absolutely phenomenal, and getting the opportunity to share that experience with visitors as they came ashore and that kind of thing, and show the insights that we were finding and point out the different characters of different penguins and so forth. It's just amazing. Absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I quite agree. I mean, I think you really brought it to life there. One thing you did miss out, though, was the aroma. How does it smell down in the penguin colony? Eau de krill. Brilliant. Coming to a perfume counter near you soon. Yes,
exactly. I wish. Do you know what the thing that actually struck me the most was when we were approaching the very first sign that we were coming anywhere near a penguin colony. We were more than a mile away. I didn't even hear them. I smelt them first. because the wind was blowing that direction. Yes, it is incredibly pungent. It's got a very special smell. It kind of impregnates your clothes and everything. And once you've been there for a while, you don't notice it anymore. And then, as my colleague at the time, Jane, said, other people start to notice it, and you're like, what smell? Oops. But I love it. And when I came back, I actually kept a T-shirt. I didn't wash it for about a year, and every now and again, I'd open the bag and just go, it was lovely. It just took me right back there.
that is dedication. Goodness. Oh, amazing. Mike, I mean, you study the penguins on the peninsula, don't you? These the Gentoo and other species. What? I mean, they're great characters. They're fascinating. They're funny. The story of their breeding cycle is so interesting. But why do we study penguins? Why is the science important? And how do you study penguins? How to study penguins?
Well, I'll start actually with two key answers to why do we actually study penguins. The first really comes from the fact that penguins are in trouble. They're not doing great. We spoke at the beginning that there are 18 species. Well, 10 of those are actually directly threatened. And of more than half of all of the species are actually in decline. So there's a lot of work to be done if we're going to actually protect penguins in the future and conserve them. And the more that we actually understand about them, which takes research, then the more we can help them. And there's still huge gaps in our knowledge, our basic understanding of the natural history of a lot of these species, particularly when they're at sea, particularly when it's the non-breeding season. Because the breeding seasons, when we can access them much more easily, they're on their nests, we know where they are. When they're out at sea, that's very difficult. So there's a lot of work to be done there to actually improve our knowledge and ultimately, hopefully, improve life for penguins. The second answer I would give, which is equally important, really, is the importance of penguins within their own ecosystem. They're very, very sensitive to change. Although they don't sit right at the top of their food chain, they're pretty high up. They're what we call higher predators. And that makes them what we also call bioindicator species. Now, a bioindicator species is an animal that we can actually monitor, not only to understand how its own populations are changing, but to get a handle on the drivers of those changes. So in other words, what is happening in its wider environment that's causing it to change in some way. Penguins in some parts of the Southern Ocean can make up to as much as 80 or 90% of the entire bird biomass. So most of the birds will be penguins. And that results in them taking literally millions and millions of tons of food out of the ocean every year, which is not a bad thing, but it again emphasizes just how important these animals are in the food chain. So we live in a changing world. We know there's things like climate change taking place. There's lots of pressures. And if we're going to understand what the drivers of these changes are and how they're going to affect lots of different species, including penguins, well, the penguins are actually core to our understanding of that. So it's another really important reason why we want to maintain our long-term studies on penguin species.
No, that's really interesting. So what techniques do you adopt to study penguins? Is it going out there and counting them with a clipboard, or is it do you use technology? What does a penguinologist do?
Well, there's a bit of both. Unfortunately, as we all know, they all look the same. So counting them it can be not that great at times. But fortunately, with the species that I work with, they shape themselves out into smaller colonies. So, for example, you might have an area and you say, "Oh, right, there's 100,000 penguins there. Crikey, that's a lot." But actually, they'll exist in smaller subcolonies of maybe a couple of hundred, maybe up to 1,000. So the smaller colonies we can monitor literally by directly counting. We can go there, we can sit nearby, we can do head counts on the number of occupied nests. We can do that annually. Over time, if we're also monitoring the number of chicks that are produced and the numbers of chicks that survive, then we can work out breeding success relative to the number of pairs that started breeding in any given year. So suddenly we can get this well, 1 year would be a snapshot, but if we do it for, say, 30, 40 years, then we've got really, really crucial information on penguin populations, which is where my research comes in. However, when we want to enhance our knowledge, we want to increase the number of birds that we're counting, particularly when they're in very inaccessible places. And in the Antarctic, researchers, we can only go to certain spots. Filmmakers, Ruth and co can only get to certain spots, and they can do great stuff there. But there's huge areas where we just can't get to. And this is where technology can help us, because we can use things like satellite imagery. We can use drone technology also. And both of these platforms can really give us a much more powerful tool to see more. We can take images, and from those, we can actually get accurate counts, accurate population estimates of populations of species that we otherwise just wouldn't be able to do.
So it's really filling in the blanks, isn't it? The sort of technology, this remote sensing, if you like, is allowing you to fill in those blanks and improve our understanding of sort of penguin population dynamics and things. Absolutely fascinating. Yeah. So what changes are we seeing? We know, we know the climate is changing, and we know the climate in the Antarctic Peninsula is it's warming really fast. What impact is that having on the species that we're seeing there? So, Ruth, do you want to go first?
I don't mind. Ruth, did you want to? I know I've been speaking for a minute or two there.
I'm very happy to. Not so happy to share this news, but I know since 1974 there's been a decline in Adelie populations along the Western Peninsula of 85%, which is a huge number, and that coincides with changes in sea ice. So there's much more sea ice melt occurring across those areas, and the Adelies are very much dependent on krill for food and will forage underneath the sea ice, and also changes in snowfall, which is impacting their nesting ability and the success of their nests, because all of these species have evolved to breed at exactly the right time, when the snow is exactly the right consistency, whether that be still frozen or it's completely melted. And if the snow suddenly melts while you've got young downy chicks in the nests, those chicks are not prepared for that snow. Their downy feathers are not waterproof, and they will sadly suffer hypothermia. And even if the snow melt is severe enough, that they might even drown. So it's not good news for the species, particularly in that region. And Mike, I'm sure you've got more things to add to that.
Thanks, Ruth. Well, it's really, really spot on what you've said there. And the Adelie is one of the three species that I've spent a lot of time studying. Not so much on the peninsula, but on a small group of islands relatively close to the peninsula, the South Orkney Islands. And it's a similar pattern to what you've just described on the peninsula. Over 40 years, we've seen a 40% decline in Adelies there. And to give you an idea that this just doesn't just affect one species, we've seen an over 70% decline in chinstrap penguins. And yes, you get a lot of precipitation in the form of rain now, which floods nests. If you've got a nest with eggs in, then that can freeze and kill the eggs that way. The young chicks, as you just explained, it will kill them from the cold and the wet. Other problems that we're getting as well on the peninsula is you're touching on lack of sea ice there. That really affects the range of some penguins, the range being the area where some penguins live. Adelies need that. It does work in roundabouts though, and this is where it can get quite confusing, because the Gentoos, our friends from Port Lockroy, they're doing really well. They're actually increasing at the moment, moving further south. So as the climate changes and the environment changes, that does suit them as a species. But we also get food shifts as well. And what I'm talking about there is you get climate-driven changes in the availability of food, of productivity in the ocean. And this isn't just in the Antarctic. This is all the places where penguins live, so all over the world. But specifically speaking with penguins, those changes are really important because they happen over a temporal period. So depending on the time they change, you can get a mismatch. And what I'm talking about there is you might find at a particular time of year when penguins are foraging for chicks, the food, whether it's fish, krill, squid, whatever they're after, might not be there anymore, or at least it might not be there in particularly large quantities. And these are slightly more subtle problems, but they're massive problems nevertheless, because they can result in really big localized population crashes. We've seen some of that actually in South Africa with the South African penguin. Pollution, another problem. Not so much that one in the Antarctic, although you can get things like ingestion of plastics anywhere, because terrible things like that spread throughout the oceans of the world. Conflict with human fisheries and entanglement as bycatch, that's an increasing problem. And in places where penguins live on land with people, so on the continents where people exist, you can get problems with introduced pests, diseases, predation from introduced predators as well, rats, cats, things like that. So yeah, there's a lot of problems out there for penguins. And when you start to think about them and stack them up like this, you do start to think, oh yeah, wow, there's, most penguins aren't unlucky enough to face all of them, although climate change, of course, is a problem everywhere. But nevertheless, when you start looking at individual species, you realise, and you combine it together, there's a lot of challenges out there. There really is.
No, I mean, I think the picture you're both painting is of an animal that is incredibly well adapted to the environment that it's used to, and it's incredibly recognizable, has this amazing shape and all these adaptations, but within a changing climate or a changing environment, suddenly these pressures are being applied, and we're seeing problems and huge pressures on these animals, which we must try hard to protect and reverse somehow. So I mean, fascinating. I mean, I think you're both clearly committed and incredibly knowledgeable. I'm going to put all this to the test, or in fact, our audience are. Are you ready for some questions?
Yes, bring it on.
I can see our audience have been firing the questions in, so I'm going to ask my colleague behind the scenes to start sharing some of those, and let's see. Yes, I think you do need to drink there, Mike. Okay. So the first one up is, how long is the breeding life of a penguin? So.
Well,
do you want to jump in? Yeah.
Again, it varies massively between different species. So in captivity, penguins have been shown to live up to 20 or more years, and obviously they'll keep breeding right up into old age. But as we already explained this evening, there are a lot of predators out there, and there are a lot of pressures on a penguin, so it's very unlikely that a penguin would live anywhere near that age, and you're probably looking at more about sort of 10 years maximum, really, for a penguin. But they don't start breeding until they're around about 3 for the brush-tailed species, and by that I'm talking about the Gentoos, the chinstraps, and the Adelie penguins.
Just an add-on question to that: do they mate for life? Are they monogamous partners, or are they prolific?
Ooh. Mike, do you want to break the magic?
Okay. A lot of them are monogamous for a single season. Some will repeatedly mate with partners over a number of years, but others don't. And even then, it's not necessary. It's not like, for example, swans back home, where you think, oh yeah, that's a pair, and they just stick together throughout their lifespan. So no, it's not quite, I think, what the general perception is with penguins. Some of them are really not particularly monogamous at all. That said, during a single season, they usually will stick with their partner, and you won't get so much extra pair copulation. That is fairly rare, or rather, I should say, it's something that we know not that much about, but it appears fairly rare.
Yeah, you've not necessarily measured it, but
I think it probably happens more than we believe it does, and it's hard because penguins all look the same. So you kind of end up anthropomorphizing, and I think particularly over the years, people have kind of written what they want to believe to a degree. I'm kind of doing science a massive disservice here, and I'm really sorry. I will never be invited back again. But I think over the years, people have kind of seen a pair together, seen two penguins that look quite similar, and assumed that they've been a pair there for the whole season. But in my own experience, I've seen what we might call divorces. I've seen a lot of extra pair copulation happening, and I know that it does, there have been genetic studies that have been taking place that show that it is more probably prevalent than we sort of want to or have necessarily been led to believe so far. So I think, once again, as genetics tells us more and reveals more, we'll probably find that there's a bit more of that going on than we perhaps always thought. But generally they are quite, I think, as Mike said, I want to believe that generally throughout a breeding season they'll be quite faithful.
Yeah. No, I think, but one of the purposes of this evening is a bit of myth busting. So it's great to hear these, these real insights. So thank you. We're ready for the next question. Okay, has there ever been a breed of penguin that has had the ability to fly? So stretching back. Oh, Ruth, go for it.
So not a penguin as such. So they evolved. They sort of started off too big to fly, and they've sort of evolved to become smaller as the years have gone on. Generally, looking back through the fossil records. However, if you look towards the northern hemisphere, the auks are kind of the closest thing, I would say, and they do fly. Things like puffins that you might be familiar with, little auks, and razorbills and things. They are all related. So I think that's probably the closest. I think that's right, isn't it, Mike?
Yeah, it's perhaps worth saying as well, the ancestral seabirds that the penguins evolved from would have been flying birds as well, way back in the Cretaceous. Ruth was talking about earlier, 66 million years ago. These would have been flying birds at the time that then evolved into early species of penguin that would have been, would have then lost the ability to fly, and you would have started to see those wings becoming flippers. But otherwise, I think that covers that one.
Great, thank you. Next question, please. Here we go. Here one from Hazel. What would you consider to be the main threat to penguins generally? And number 2, if there was one thing you could ask everyone to do to benefit penguins, what would you ask them to do? Mike, do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, okay. Well, I know we've just touched on this a few minutes ago. It's a great question. It does depend on which species we're talking about. Broadly speaking, climate change is a concern for all of us and the whole planet. So I'd probably put that one right up there. But in the case of specific species, it can have a more immediate threat. And some of them really do have that. 3 species in particular are in real trouble at the moment. And probably right at the top of that is the South African penguin. And it faces a number of threats in the water, lack of food at the moment. One of the key cold water currents that moves food around, that's absolutely critical for the breeding success of that penguin, is moving. That's a big problem. On the land as well, there are problems with habitat loss, as well as predation. So, yeah, the poor old South African penguin has got a lot of immediate threats, and some of those really could be fixed with the right will and the right effort. Other than the South African, the Galapagos penguin, that's a real concern as well. It's a very small population anyway. It's always existing on the brink, but there's been big losses over the last 30, 40 years. It's quite difficult to monitor anyway. It lives in holes in lava beds, cold lava beds. So again, that's got its local set of problems. Galapagos has been battling for years with introduced species, which can be problematic. So that's a second problem there. Yes, we like to talk about birds in the Antarctic. I think we touched on that already with a whole raft of problems. So I don't really want to list all those again. But if you could ask what everyone could do to benefit penguins, well, the big one is keep the oceans clean. That's something that we can do whether we live on a continent with penguins. We were lucky enough to do that. But here in the UK, where we sat at the moment, even though we've only got penguins in zoological collections, we can do our bit. And what you're putting into the waterways, what you're throwing away, hopefully not, we can make a difference, because this stuff ends up in the ocean otherwise. And obviously that causes terrible problems to our own rivers and waters around the UK and Europe. but this spreads out everywhere. It's a massive problem. It really is a global issue. And so we can be more careful with our recycling and making an effort there. And it does have a knock-on effect overall.
Massively, like absolutely massively. I agree with you, Mike. And I think, you know, we all say, what's the one thing you can do? One piece of litter is enough to kill one penguin. So if everybody just was a bit more responsible with thinking about choices of disposable plastic and disposing of things properly and things, then that might save just one penguin. And if everybody saves one penguin, then that's going to really help and make a difference overall.
So there you go. Yeah, I think some wise advice there. Okay, next question, please. Okay, Emma's written in, do you think penguins might ever migrate and establish in the northern hemisphere, so beyond, I suppose, the Galapagos, for example, in response to climate change, habitat or food stock threats? Who wants to take that one?
Ooh, that's a lovely thought, isn't it? Imagine looking out the window and seeing penguins. I'd love that. Obviously, you know, for the right reasons. At the moment, and again, I'm going to defer to Mike very shortly to probably correct me, but looking at some of the patterns in the currents and things, it seems to be that they're shifting further south and sort of like horizontally around. So just kind of shifting food further away from land sources, but not necessarily further north. So the change in fish stocks and things that Mike was referring to earlier is causing penguins to swim further out to sea, but not perhaps further north out to sea, and not perhaps nearer other land masses, unfortunately.
Thank you. Next question, please. So Lynn the penguin has tuned in. Where did penguins evolve, and did they evolve in one place and then move with the continental drift, or did they swim from place to place? Mike, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, okay. Penguins would have broadly, as we mentioned earlier, evolved from single ancestral species. This was at a time, late Cretaceous. You've got Pangaea, the supercontinent. Those who don't know, back then, time of the dinosaurs, and earlier than that as well, all the continents were joined together and then they gradually broke up. They're still, in fact, moving around now very slowly. They look quite different when these ancestral birds would have been around, and they would have been closer together. So what we've now got is the penguins spread out across South America, into the Antarctic, Southern Africa, and then you've got them Australia, New Zealand around there. So they didn't spread out to all of those places, but rather their ancestry spread out around those places as these land masses moved. Over that time, you've got successive rates of evolution anyway, so we get different species in different places, but we have a certain commonality as well, because some species are actually circumpolar. We can get them all around the Antarctic as well. They can travel really big distances, which might come up later as another interesting discussion. But Ruth, do you want to add any more?
No, I think you've answered that pretty well there, Mike. I think you've done a thorough job.
Great, thank you. Next question, please. Here's one. The Halley Bay Emperor colony was reported to have not returned a year or so ago, with the speculation that it may have moved to near Belgrano station. Has there been any sign of it returning? Who'd like to pick that one up?
Well, I have to say I don't know much about what's happened lately with the Halley Bay Emperor colony, so I can't really, beyond saying that colony often has problems because of where it is. For members of our audience that don't know, emperor penguins breed on sea ice. This particular area of sea ice that this colony exists on, it often experiences an early blowout. That is, the wind blows out the sea ice during the breeding season. Unfortunately, that's disastrous if it happens when the chicks are still young. The adults will be all right. They'll come back and try again the year after, but chicks or the eggs will all be lost. And that has happened a few times recently, but I don't know what's happened in the most recent case.
Okay, thank you. Well, maybe if we can follow up with that later, maybe we can do after the event. Okay, next question, please. Okay, what advice would you give to a first-time visitor to Antarctica? Ruth, do you want to take that one?
Definitely. I would say don't go with too many expectations, because undoubtedly a trip to Antarctica is never going to be what you quite think it's going to be. It's so weather dependent. But the chances are what you hope to visit or see might well change, but I guarantee you'll see something better than what you imagine. It will always be better. Wrap up very warm, take layers, and take a camera. And most importantly, make sure you take time for yourself. Take time to just enjoy those moments, because there are things that happen in Antarctica that you can't capture on camera. The colours, you'll never recreate them in an image. I've tried and tried. And I'm going to do myself out of all filmmaking jobs from now on, and hands up to it, because there are some things that you just have to experience. And that sense of peace that I mentioned earlier, you can only really get by sitting there. And if you take your time and sit with the penguins, they'll come to you as well. You know, you've got to keep 5 meters away from penguins. It's very important to not approach them and not feel that you have to try and get on top of those penguins. If you take a camera, even a mobile phone camera, you don't have to get that close. But if you sit and allow wildlife to come to you, it will always come to you. And that's what's really magical about Antarctica. Enjoy the moments.
Great advice. Mike, do you want to add anything to that one?
No, I think Ruth actually caught that one spot on.
I agree. Okay, next question, please. There we go. How much an effect is industrial fishing having on the krill population in the feeding areas for penguins and whales? So, Mike, do you want to talk a bit about, is there fishing goes on the Antarctic Peninsula, around Antarctica, and what kind of impact is that having?
Sure. Yes, there is. There certainly is. In fact, the krill industry is a growing industry, and it takes a lot of krill. One of the problems we have is we don't really know exactly how much krill is in the system. So it's very difficult to set exactly accurate quotas on that. We try to do so, but it's difficult, because if you don't know what your starting point is, you really don't know exactly what shape the system is in, how it's doing, which takes me back to that earlier point about bioindicator species, because often we then rely on species that feed on, in this case, krill, and we look at how they're doing, and perhaps if we're monitoring their diet as well, which we can do, we can see whether that's changing, how they're doing, and that can give us a bit of an idea. So at the moment, we're not sure. We're doing a lot of research to try and understand what effect commercial fishing and climate change as well, but both together may be having on the krill population. But it's a tricky one. There's a lot of work to be done there. And yes, that's in the peninsula and all around the Antarctic. You know, penguins and whales are feeding in different places. My colleagues at the British Antarctic Survey are looking at areas around the Antarctic Peninsula, because that's where the British bases are located, and that's where we focus our study on. But it's a really good question, because it's something we're very interested in. And there's a lot of research effort going into that.
Thank you. Ruth, I don't know if you have anything to add to that one?
Not to add, no.
There's a follow-up question out here from Peter. So during a visit to Antarctica in 2016, I saw a few krill factory fishing ships. As this is a main food source penguins, do you know what is being done to control or stop krill fishing? So what kind of regulation is there? Mike, do you want to? Yeah. Yeah.
If you, Ruth, unless, do you want me to run with this one, or do you want
to
go
with it? Go with it. Yeah.
Jump. Well, you can't. Well, in most cases, you know, assuming nothing's being done illegally, then people can't just go down and take krill. They get licenses, and the Antarctic is divided into a series of subunits on a map. And this is done by something called CAMLAR, the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. That sounds a bit of a mouthful, but it's really important. This is the body that governs and manages the fisheries, the human fisheries in the Southern Ocean. And the knock-on of that is, you know, the welfare of all of the animals that live in it as well. So they divide it up into these boxes, and then within those boxes, they determine internationally, so there's a lot of negotiations and politics going on with different countries, what the quotas will be from the different boxes. So that's how it's controlled. As I said earlier, it's difficult to know exactly how much of it. We know how much catch is being removed, but we don't know how much catch is already in there in the first, how much stock rather there is there in the first place. So it's difficult, but that's how it's controlled. And at the moment, that's the intention, is that that's how it would continue to be monitored. We have fisheries observers on a lot of the ships, and they're looking not only to check what's being caught, but watching out for any bycatch, because I mentioned earlier in some places penguin bycatch can be a problem. To the best of my knowledge, we haven't had any problem with penguin bycatch in the peninsula, in the Antarctic, but that's monitored to make sure that that's not happening. The biggest concern would be whether or not there's a conflict with food availability, because in some places krill is being removed close to penguin colonies during the penguin breeding season. So again, this comes back to the importance of monitoring those penguin populations really closely to see how they're doing. If they're doing okay. If they're not, then that doesn't necessarily mean that's definitely related to the krill industry either. We have to be absolutely sure. Such a changing environment, we mentioned earlier, there could be a multitude of other drivers, or or perhaps all acting together, or there might be one key one. But it's something that's very, very important, and is being closely monitored.
Yeah, I mean, the concern is, of course, that this is a primary food source for penguins, as has been pointed out. And by the time the science has caught up with the impact that humans are having, perhaps it might be too late. So it is very important, this scientific work that's happening at the moment. And as you've said, there are a lot of tight regulations involved with this fishing, and it is heavily regulated. But that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be something that we should remain concerned about.
Thank you both. Okay, another question. So Fiona has texted in the book, The Penguin Lessons, it begins with a horrendous death of penguins through oil slicks through unmonitored and unregulated oil dumping at sea. Does this still happen in those southern regions? Is that something you come across, Ruth? Do you want to comment on that one?
I have read that book. It's a very, very good book, and I highly recommend it. It's not, I mean, kind of, it's said there in the question itself, unmonitored and unregulated. So the chances are that it is still happening on some level, but we're not monitoring it, and it's certainly not regulated. So it probably happens without us knowing. I mean, it hasn't happened so much since then. I can't remember the date now off the top of my head. I should have checked that before I came. But I don't know of any examples where it's happened particularly recently that we haven't been aware of. Certainly not dumping that's affected penguins in that way. I mean, obviously sometimes accidents happen with tankers and so forth, and there have been incidences of oil spills. Again, with the South African penguin, it's another problem that's happened with seabirds around that area quite recently. And it's any human activity really has the potential to cause problems. And luckily, the science is out there, and there are a lot of regulations in place in Antarctica to try and protect the wildlife and ensure that what anybody does in Antarctica and the Southern Ocean is very much limiting any negative impact on its wildlife.
Thank you. Mike, is there anything else you'd like to add to that one?
No, I think that answered it really well, Ruth. Thanks.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Okay, Hazel's been in. What do you think are the best ways to inspire people to care about these species and their habitat in Antarctica, which many will never get to experience firsthand? Although I have to say, possibly this is a good way. But anything you can recommend that might inspire people to engage more with the penguins? Mike, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I'm just thinking about it, actually. We're very lucky because, as we said earlier, we spent a lot of time down there. But I think education's a really big one. Whether it's educating adults or if you start young, that's brilliant. If you're educating children, not just for penguins, but for a love and caring of the natural world. Because at the end of the day, we humans are the custodians of the planet. I don't think we're particularly good custodians as a species. There's a lot of we can do a lot better, I have to say, and I think we'd all agree with that. But we can start by educating people, and the more you educate people about the natural world, then the more they'll care about it, and they'll feel that they have an investment in it as well. So I think that's, for me, that would be the really big one. And that could be educating children about wildlife on their own patch, whether in a town or a city, or they're on a little bit of coast somewhere. That could be someone watching a wildlife documentary showing what's happening on the other side of the world, such as in the Antarctic. But however it's done, and they are connected because they've got this fundamental caring. We mentioned earlier, what can you do? How can you do your bit to help penguins? Well, even on the other side of the world, if you're making an effort to not pollute the planet, then that's going to help. Ruth made that point, I thought, really well earlier. So yeah, and please do come in, Ruth, on this. But I would say for me, education would be the really big first one.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think that also goes hand in hand with immersing yourself in different ways, whether that's in, as you've said, the wildlife in your own back garden, in your own country, because once you get to experience that and you feel at one with nature and you kind of see bird life and other life, then you can appreciate and kind of how that might transpose itself into other environments around the world. And then through reading books, and even, there are lots of works of fiction out there that feature penguins and Antarctica, and I have to say some of those are completely immersive and actually would very much inspire you to help look after that wildlife, probably just as much as documentaries and other things. And I would absolutely implore everybody to watch Penguin Post Office. I'm going to do a shameless plug here. Just because if you want to fall in love with the penguins at Port Lockery, then I think you should watch that film.
I would 100% endorse that, yes. But I think the point being, isn't it, that you don't have to go to Antarctica to really enjoy penguins and to understand them and to, as you say, immerse yourself in how fascinating they are. Okay, we've got a couple more minutes, so I'll take a couple more questions. So could I have next one, please? Here's one about South Georgia, so one of our subantarctic islands. Can you comment about the condition of the South Georgia populations of penguins? So what kind of penguins are there on South Georgia and how are they doing? Mike, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, well, we've got several species of penguin at South Georgia. We've got macaronis, which by far make up the bulk of the biomass, the numbers of penguins up there. We've got kings. We've got some very big populations of kings. Places like Salisbury Plain out there, which are really spectacular, especially if people are lucky enough to be able to visit and see them. Gentoos breed there as well. You've got smaller populations of chinstraps that sometimes turn up, well, that do breed there. And then you've got other vagrants that turn up as well, including the odd daily. But we're actually overdue another really large penguin population survey on South Georgia. It's such a big island that it's very difficult to do regularly. So what we do instead is we do our monitoring on a subsection of colonies. At Bird Island, the British Antarctic Survey's got one of its oldest bases, and there we monitor the macaronis and the gentoos. Those are the two species that breed on that island. This is an island about a kilometre away from South Georgia, maybe a bit less. So to all intents and purposes, it's part of South Georgia as far as the birds populations are concerned. So we study them and we see how they're doing, and we use those as a bioindicator of what's happening with the larger population. Largely speaking, the macaroni population has actually been declining for a number of years. The gentoos generally doing okay, but touching on what I said earlier about using drones, it's that's really opening up, and actually only in the last year we started to do my colleagues, because I wasn't working on that particular project, but my colleagues at South Georgia have started to overfly a number of these penguin colonies and other seabirds as well, albatross colonies, for example, with drones and to carry out surveys. So there's a big survey plan for the coming season, which will add to our knowledge. It does mean I can't give you an accurate, simple answer right now, but if you ask me in a year's time, then hopefully there'll be some literature out there, a published scientific paper with an update on those populations.
Great. Let's make a date, shall we? Okay, I've got time for one more question. Okay, is there a prevailing myth or misconception regarding penguins that you'd like to, once and for all, clarify? I'm thinking about the one about Falkland Island penguins falling over every time a plane went over. It's that famous myth. Ruth, do you want to explode a myth for us?
Well, in terms of penguins falling over every time a plane went over, I've heard that myth also, and I've also been part of scientific teams that have flown drones over penguins, and they've not all fallen over, thankfully, when they've done that, because that really would be a problem. So they're very, very curious animals, and I'm sure in that case, what happened was a plane flew over, a penguin looks up to see what was happening and probably did lose its balance and fall over, because they can't like twist their head as they're looking over particularly well, and they're not particularly well balanced on land, unfortunately. It's one of the things that's so endearing about them. They fall over constantly, all of the time, and of course we find it absolutely hilarious. Poor penguins. Yeah, so I'm going to throw that myth once and for all. I'm sure Mike's going to tell me I'm completely wrong. One of my favorite myths is that you see a lot of penguins sneezing frequently in Antarctica, and people are like, oh my goodness, they've all got flu, and no doubt now people are going to be terrified that they've got COVID. And I can assure you, for now, that is absolutely not the case, but penguins do frequently sneeze, and they're using what's known as a supraorbital gland, which is just beneath their eyes, and it actually takes out excess salt, because they spend so much time in the water. They don't drink fresh water. They get a lot of salt, and they shake their heads in order to get that salt out, and you get a lot of salt coming out of their like little nostrils here, and it does indeed look like they're sneezing. They make sort of little noises. I can't do a very good sneeze noise over this microphone, thankfully. But they're not. They don't have bird flu generally, or and certainly not colds and COVID and things.
Thank goodness. And Mike, have you got a myth you'd like to explode?
By the way, that was a brilliant one. I thought that was a great, Ruth. Really, really great. I'm not going to say anything about falling over penguins either. So let's have a think. Short-sighted, or rather than not. I think there's a myth that the penguins are a bit short-sighted, particularly on land. That comes from, it's a fairly good guess to assume that, a good assumption, because animals that evolve on land, so they're used to looking through the medium of air. Well, air and water both have different refractive properties. So animals like us, evolved on the land, tend to be long-sighted in the water. And it's the other way around. Creatures that have evolved in the water, if they're on the land, they tend to be short-sighted. So you'd think that would be the case with penguins, except of course they're not. They live on the land, they go in the water. And in actual fact, they've got great eyesight in both mediums. And the way they do this is quite clever. But, well, first of all, without going into too much detail, the shape of their eye. The cornea is relatively flat, and they've got little muscles around the eye as well, which allow them to alter the shape of their eye lens, depending on whether they're in air or water. So, they are not struggling with their eyesight when they're on land.
Wow, another excellent myth to be busted there. And I wish I could do that with mine and get rid of the glasses.
Me too, yeah.
Exactly. Well, our hour is just about up. So I just want to say thank you to the both of you for sharing your expertise and insights. I mean, truly fascinating. And I think we've learned an awful lot actually about penguins tonight. And I think not least how gnarly they are and how they're able to survive with these, appalling conditions, but also how connected we are to them. I mean, I think you've made a really strong case to say that, the things that we do here can directly impact penguins in the Southern Ocean. And I think that for me is a huge takeaway tonight. So thank you for that. So Ruth and Michael, thank you so much for your sharing all your knowledge and expertise, and it's been a really, really enjoyable conversation. I'd like to thank all of you in the audience for joining us tonight and for sharing your questions. There were far more than we could answer, so I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions, but we may try and find ways on social media to perhaps to do that. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. I think it's been a really wonderful evening. Please let us know what you thought of tonight's event. Leave your comments in the chat or get in touch with us by social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, or email us at info@ukaht.org. And I'd like to say thank you very much to our sponsor, Viking, of course, for supporting this webinar, but also the whole series of Antarctica Insight Live. one little plug I must do. If you haven't already, please do consider adopting a penguin. So one thing you can do to help the study of penguins and to help what we do at the Antarctic Host Trust at Port Lockroy is it is the perfect Christmas gift, and you will be directly supporting a real colony by enabling our work at Port Lockroy in studying the Gentoo colony and protecting the environment where they live and looking after the heritage on the island. You'll find more details in the links in the comments, but also on screen now, and also on our website. We have 6 of these events coming up. This is the first of 6. Our next event will be on the 5th of January. We're taking a different tack. We'll be delving into heroism and what we can learn about and from those heroic Antarctic explorers, both past and present, with record-breaking polar explorer Ben Saunders and historian Henrietta Hammond. So please join us then for that. You can sign up from the link in the comments or on our website, and we'll be promoting it on social media as well. So do join us for that. It should be a fascinating evening. But for now, thank you everybody for making this such an enjoyable and interesting evening. And may I wish you all, when it comes, a very happy Christmas, and I look forward to seeing you in the new year. Good night.